We have a bunch of people joining in right now, guys, so we're just going to give folks another minute to get situated before we begin.
Okay, I think we can get started. Awesome. So hi everyone, my name is Samantha. I am the Director of Marketing at Pay. For those of you who aren't familiar with Pay, Pay's mission is to provide e-commerce merchants security and network level chargeback protection.
What's going on, everybody? I'm Nicholas Ruggieri. I am the co-founder and chief sales officer with Pinpoint Payments. We are a payment service provider that specializes in the online space and e-commerce. We are a two-time Inc. 5000 recognized company and have been in the e-commerce space for the better half of a decade. Super pumped up to be here today. I think this is going to be a really informative webinar, especially given what's going on in the payment ecosystem with respect to COVID. So I'm really looking forward to going over some of this info. And Sam, I'm really looking forward to hearing more about the ins and outs of utilizing 3D Secure.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, cool. So this webinar is all about friendly fraud. That's a big topic right now, and we're going to show you guys how you can protect your business from friendly fraud without false declines or disputes. So just a little context. I mean, it's no surprise that social distancing has catalyzed e-commerce business. And as a result, disputes are skyrocketing. Some industries are even seeing disputes at 20%. The most challenging thing about this probably is that most of those disputes, 86% of them, are not because the cardholder was a victim to true fraud. It's actually because of friendly fraud, also known as chargeback fraud. The terms are synonymous. Some people might say the difference is that chargeback fraud is malicious, whereas friendly fraud, the consumer is innocent. Maybe they just forgot they made the purchase. But at the end of the day, there's no way to differentiate either when it happens. It's a legitimate cardholder making a legitimate transaction. Afterwards, they call up their bank and dispute the charge. And 99% of the time, the bank will take the side of the cardholder and they'll initiate the chargeback process to refund the customer. And that is a challenge that everyone's facing right now. And we have a solution, and we're going to go through how that works. The other thing I'd like to mention is with e-commerce, it's really tricky using the fraud tools, because even if you have top of the line fraud tools, they can't prevent friendly fraud because it happens after the transaction takes place. Fraud tools can predict true fraud, and they do a good job. However, they're also leading to false declines. Using overly stringent algorithms, legitimate cardholders are being denied and transactions aren't going through. It's estimated that by 2021, as you can see on the slide, false declines will reach 443 billion. So what can you do? Or Nico, do you have something to say?
I was gonna chime in respect to the current state of things right now with COVID and whatnot. One of the previous slides that you had was showing the impact that it's had on overall chargebacks, and kind of it gives you almost like an insight as to what's going on with the space as a whole. And I can tell you that we're seeing from a portfolio perspective, the overall number of chargebacks have increased significantly. I know that in the slide, I believe it mentioned some folks were seeing upwards of 20%, I think, within the travel space and lodging and hotel space. Their chargeback numbers are going through the roof. I think it's also important to note, and we can touch on this a little bit later, but I think everybody right now is seeing an overall increase in their chargebacks. And I think the primary reason for that is because, let's be honest, people are really in two different positions, right? You're either not so impacted by COVID and you're continuing to work and, you know, you're just pushing through with some of the minor changes, or you've been impacted significantly and you are forced to now pay a bit more attention to your financials, right? That means looking at your credit and debit card statements a little bit more thoroughly, right? Picking out the things that, you know, you truly want to spend your money on and the things that perhaps are more of a luxury. And with that, I think people are also starting to figure out, hey, what transactions or which purchases over the last several weeks can I try to get my money back on, right? And what they're resorting to doing is contacting their banks, knowing that COVID is a big situation right now. And they're basically filing, you know, these friendly chargebacks on these purchases as a means to try to get some money back. And it's unfortunate that people have to resort to that right now, but that's what we're seeing a lot of right now. And I think that as we go on further within the webinar, people are going to start to realize just how important this tool is at protecting their business. Because I think no matter what kind of business you have right now, you guys are probably seeing that increase in overall chargeback ratios across the board.
Yeah, we for sure are at pay as well with our customer base. We've seen the increase in e-commerce transactions. People are doing a lot more volume and there are definitely a lot more chargebacks happening now. So, drum roll, we have a solution. It's a solution that actually, I would say it's better than traditional fraud prevention tools, but it's quite common to layer it with the fraud tools. This will not lead to false declines, and this will protect you from friendly fraud. And you can thank the credit card networks for this. So the card networks developed EMV3DS. And EMV3DS is Pay's bread and butter. This is what we've done since the get-go, and this is what we focus on. We focus on providing the solution to e-com merchants. And essentially how it works is it's a security program developed by the card networks that allows the acquiring bank to communicate with the issuing bank to conduct a risk-based analysis in the back end and verify the cardholder in real time at the time of the purchase. Once that verification is done, as a merchant, you receive a chargeback liability shift. And this all happens in the background, unseen by the cardholder. And the reason why you guys get a liability shift is because the card networks wanted to increase the adoption of 3DS. So they created this as a benefit to protect merchants and to incentivize other businesses to adopt 3DS. So I get a lot of questions about how it really works and what's happening. So we're gonna walk you guys through that on a really high level now. So basically a cardholder will go to your e-commerce site. They will begin to type in their credit card information, and the acquiring bank will then send a message to the 3DS server requesting that identity check or that verification. So from there, it goes to the server. You can think of the server as like the middleman between the acquirer and the issuer. And that server then has to communicate to the issuer and ask them to do the 3DS authentication. Once they complete the authentication using risk-based analysis, it's either a yes or no message on whether or not the cardholder was verified. That message gets sent back to you as the merchant through the 3DS server, and then that has to get passed along to the gateway and the processor to successfully complete a transaction with a chargeback liability shift. So all of this is happening in the background. Pay's software solution sits on your payment page. It's a few lines of code, and that code allows all of this to happen in the back end to get you the liability shift. And regardless of whether or not the cardholder was verified, the transaction will always go through as normal. It would just, instead of a yes message, it would be a no message and you wouldn't get the liability shift. But I want to emphasize that there are no false declines and every single transaction goes through. It's just whether or not it received the liability shift.
Right,
so,
good point. Sam, if I could just even make it more simplistic too for the folks that may have got kind of lost in translation there. I mean, really what it comes down to is when you have a sale, right? Consumer makes their purchase. There's literally no friction on that checkout process for them. They don't recognize whether you're utilizing 3DS or you're not. To them, they're making the purchase as they normally would and going about their normal behaviors. As Sam indicated on the back end, is where all of this, kind of comes together and all the moving pieces do their part. Really what it comes down to is either the sale is going to get authenticated and protected, or it's not. But either way, the sale is still going to go through. There will not be any kind of impact to your overall conversion rate. I just want to emphasize that, just like you did, Sam, as well, because I know that when we discuss this option with our clients, that's the number one question that they have. Of course, anybody in e-commerce wants to make sure that their conversion rate is not going to be negatively impacted. That's the overall, goal here. We don't want to have any kind of negative impact on the sales that you're generating for the business. The goal is simply to just get that authentication or not and move on. And as you mentioned as well, the sales that do get positively authenticated, you're no longer liable for those fraud-related chargebacks, which is key, because I don't know that most people truly understand how we, from the payment side, look at chargebacks. But it's not just your overall chargeback ratio that comes into play. It's how it's broken down. How many of those chargebacks are fraud-related, and how many of them are, for other reasons. And so, when you have folks that have a higher fraud-related dispute ratio, that becomes an issue as well. And I don't think that a lot of people throughout the e-commerce space truly understand that. So in addition to reducing the overall number of your chargebacks, the fact that it's hyper-focused on fraud-related chargebacks is, even more important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also want to emphasize that since the get-go, Pay has been laser focused on making sure that our product does not impact conversion rates or lead to any sort of cart abandonment. There is some misinformation in the industry, and you might read a little bit about how the 3DS 1.0 solution created friction at checkout. That's not the case anymore. That's not the case in general, industry-wise, but especially with Pay and Pay's product that we've created and how our solution works. So some of the details, currently as is in the market, 3DS and our solution protects the first transaction and the first recurring transaction. We find that extremely valuable for a lot of our customers, especially subscription-based merchants. The chargeback usually happens on the first recurring transaction. And currently, on average, we're seeing about 65 to 85% of transactions authenticated, meaning that yes message was passed along and those transactions get the chargeback liability shift. In the future, once the industry adapts and rolls out the 2.1, which is an upgraded version of 3DS, we're going to be seeing about 98, 99% authentication rates. And that's because the issuing banks will have access to a lot more data. Pay internally, we've already begun to roll out our 2.1 solution. As you saw though on the other slides, there's a lot of moving pieces. The gateway is like a part of it, the processor is a part of it, the issuer is a part of it. So globally, everyone's kind of picking up and updating to 1.2 slowly. So our 1.2 solution is ready. And if you are on a processor gateway combo that is 2.1 ready, then you will 100% put you on that version. However, the majority of the global payment ecosystem is currently still on the 1.0, which would still get you the 65 to 85% authentication rates. So really to get started with 3DS, it's pretty simple. We've designed our solution to make it easy for small businesses and enterprise businesses, but in general, we wanted to make sure that the integration is simple. And all you really need to get started is a customizable checkout page. And you just need to make sure that the gateway and the processor that you're working with accept the 3DS values, meaning they accept that yes message. And I do want to point out that all of Pinpoint solutions are compatible. Okay, so here we have a case study. So one of our customers is a nutraceutical merchant. Their average ticket size was $45 and their chargeback ratio was over 2%. So they were like about to lose their mid. They were gonna get shut down because their chargebacks were too high. So before Pay, this is what their situation looked like. They had a pretty high volume of monthly transactions. And as Nicholas already mentioned, it's not just the chargeback, there's additional fees. There's you get dinged with a fee, there's shipping costs, there's a cost of the item. So what you're losing really, really adds up quickly and affects the bottom line. In this case, the customer was losing almost $300,000 a month. And then once they integrated Pay's solution onto their checkout page, they were able to save annually over $3 million. We got their chargeback ratio down to 0.05%. And I think for all of us, that was a big win. And that's just because with the chargeback liability shift, the chargeback doesn't even hit your account. You don't even know that it happens, and it doesn't impact your chargeback ratios at all. It goes straight to the issuing bank. Another benefit or value add I'd like to highlight is with the 2.1 version of 3DS, we're seeing increased approval rates. Visa recently conducted a study that also aligns with what we've seen, and it's an increase. It varies across verticals, but in general, it's a 2 to 7% increase in approval rates. This is with the 2.1 version of the protocol. And again, that's just because the issuing bank has access to so much more data to verify that cardholder. They feel more confident. So when they see the transaction has been authenticated by 3DS, the approval rates tend to increase a little bit.
Yeah, that's a really good point too, Sam, because I know that a lot of folks right now are also being impacted by overall decline rates. And it's not, it's not a big topic of discussion a lot of times. But when you do utilize the service from 3DS and you're able to kind of see that lift, it's just that icing on the cake. It's aside from reducing your overall chargeback exposure, you're now able to potentially see a lift in your overall acceptance rates. I mean, that's money in the bank right there, so.
Yeah, and another thing that I didn't elaborate on too much is one, Pay doesn't lead to false declines because we let every transaction go through as normal. But if you are using other fraud prevention tools to prevent true fraud, a very strategic way to use Pay to significantly reduce your false declines is that if a transaction is authenticated by 3DS, consider that like your first line of defense. And if it is authenticated, you're protected. So you don't need to run it through an additional fraud prevention tool that might lead to a false decline. So if you're taking 65 to 85% of your transactions that are protected and no longer running them through a fraud tool that may decline them, you're going to significantly reduce your false declines. And again, there's no impact on the checkout experience whatsoever. It's completely frictionless. It's all happening in the back end. No disputes, I mentioned that as well. The chargeback goes straight to the issuing bank, so you are not dealing with it in any way whatsoever, and increased approval rates. So this is kind of a last summary slide for us. Yeah, so I'll leave some time now for questions, and I do also want to highlight an offer that we're doing. It's specific to Pinpoint, so if you're interested in getting started 3DS, you can contact Nicholas and he can get you started on our 1-month free trial.
I do see one question that came in during the slides, and I know that we touched briefly on it, but somebody's question was, what is the key difference between the different versions of 3D Secure that you had mentioned? I believe this was closer to the beginning of the webinar. There was a slide that mentioned the authentication, the number of the percentage of those that get authenticated versus those that don't, saw a dramatic increase between the two different versions, and they wanted to know what's the difference and kind of what's the ETA on rolling out the secondary version.
So the difference is really the data that the issuing bank has to determine if it's the cardholder. With the upgraded version 2.1, the issuing bank has access to 10 times the number of data points to verify that cardholder. So that's why they're able to verify many more. Whereas within the 1.0 version, it's a little bit more limited. And for example, if the IP address isn't, it looks a little off, or if the device isn't their typical laptop that they use, they might play it on the safe side and not authenticate it. Whereas they have a lot more data to work with, so they can authenticate a lot more transactions. Because most of them, again, aren't aren't criminals. It's regular people. We just need enough information to verify who they are. And then the rollout of that industry-wide, I'd say it's really, is it by the end of December, or there's a couple mandates. I know Visa's already mandated globally, actually. Is that correct, Surly? And then MasterCard is?
MasterCard has a global mandate for all issuers to be up and running with 2.1 already in place. Visa, it's region dependent. So like in Canada, the mandate already exists and all the issuers have to be up and running with 2.1. If they're not, they get penalized and you get the automatic liability shift when you attempt to do an authentication. In the US, that will be in effect as of August.
Okay, yeah, so I had that mixed up. So it's up to the different card brands, and then as well as the issuing banks, the gateways, the processors. So it is a bit of a rollout, but we already have customers using 2.1 and it's extremely successful. They've seen that 98% authentication rate. So yeah.
Okay, we got a couple other questions here too. And for the folks who aren't aware, there is a Q&A button on the bottom towards the lower part of the Zoom here. If you do have other questions, feel free to fire them off. This one says, how is 3DS compatible with a trial offer, and what transactions would be protected? This one, I also believe that you may have answered, Sam, in the beginning in respect to how many transactions get authenticated when it goes through the system, and how this would be applicable for, let's say, like a trial offer where they have an introductory rate and then the rebill starts from there on out.
Yeah, so the first purchase is protected, and then the first initial rebill is usually how it works. Surly, do you want to elaborate? I know you work with a lot of trial customers closely with them, so. So
yeah, you can protect both the first initial and then the first rebill, right? The initial transaction gets protected in the regular way. We authenticate at the time of the transaction and pass the data through to protect that transaction. The first rebill would be protected a little bit differently. You'd be authenticating at the time of the transaction, and then you would send the data along with that first rebill. It would only be those two in the series though. The rest of the recurring transactions would not be protected, but that is an upgrade that is coming hopefully fourth quarter of this year.
Yeah, that would be the 2.2 version, correct? Yeah.
Correct.
So
2.2
there are always
mechanisms.
Yeah, there are always updates to the version protocol. The same way there's updates to your iPhone and you have to download the new iOS. But the good thing about the way we've built our system is the majority of the time as a customer of ours and as a merchant using the software, you don't need to do anything. We'll make sure that you get updated as the updates come out.
Awesome. Okay, we got one other question that just came in now with respect to the overall acceptance rate that we talked about. The question is asking how is it that the program itself is able to assist with the increase in the overall acceptance rate? So it looks like they're asking, let me see if I can summarize this question a little bit better. It looks like they're asking how it is that 3D Secure can play an impact or role in improving the overall acceptance rate of their transactions. So I think this goes back to a slide that we talked about. I think it's a couple different verticals that were mentioned.
Just really go for it. I can see you want to say.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, the reason that it would impact the approval rate is because with version 2.1, they've really tied their systems together. And now they know that this is a more secure transaction and one that's being done by the cardholder. So that would automatically give reason to give a boost in the approval. The systems are now communicating with each other. In the past, they were kind of separate systems, authentication, authorization. Now there's more communication between the two, allowing for increased data to pass through. And again, hit not just the authentication, but the approval as well.
Right. Makes sense. So they feel more comfortable allowing those transactions to go through based on the fact that they have more visibility into the transactional info.
Exactly. And into visibility of the fact that it is the cardholder making that purchase.
Got it. Okay. We got another question that came in here. If a transaction is authenticated through the 3D Secure program, how and they are a merchant, am I still involved in the chargeback process if there is a dispute? So they're saying
Nope.
if the transaction is authenticated and the consumer does make an attempt to file the dispute, are they involved in any kind of capacity?
No.
No, that chargeback goes to the card issuer. On the
Got it.
network level, it's routed that way.
Yeah,
Right,
that's the really amazing thing about it, actually. You're not dealing with it all. You don't even know that the chargeback happened. It's not your issue. It's the issuing bank's issue.
Right. So the easiest way to look at it is basically consumer is making the attempt to file the dispute. For all intents and purposes, they're basically just blocked, right? I mean, as for you as the merchant, you're not even aware that this is going on behind the scenes. You don't receive a notification. You're not penalized by way of the chargeback process. It's basically as if it never happened at all.
Yeah.
Correct.
Cool.
Any other questions, guys? It looks like those were the only ones that came through so far. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to jump into the chat there. I'll give you guys another minute or so. All right, so if nobody else has any other questions, I guess we'll go ahead and wrap it up. And I'll just leave you guys with this. As Sam indicated, for those who are not utilizing 3D Secure currently and want to take advantage of utilizing the platform, we are offering a special deal. You can certainly reach out to me. I'd be happy to discuss the details. We can get you guys plugged in, get set up. We waive all of the initial costs, and we waive all of the cost to run the transactions and the service for the first month. My email can be found on the bottom here. It's nrpinpointpayments.com. If you guys have any other questions too in regards to how the services work, or if you think about something after the fact, I know that a lot of times once I'm done with something and I'm, kind of going around it in my brain, I come up with some additional questions. Also, feel free to email me that, or you can reach out to Sam or anybody else on the Pay team. Everybody would be happy to answer those questions as well.
Perfect. And we'll follow up with the slide deck.
Yep,
To
you guys
everyone who
will get a
attended the
copy of this
webinar.
as well. So if you want to share it with anybody else on your team, or you want to revisit, I know a lot of times you guys have one earbud in. We're all doing 20 things, especially with COVID going on. You get the kids screaming or the pets, whining to go out. Totally get it. So you guys will get a copy of this so that you can re-review it at your leisure. And we want to thank everybody for coming out and tuning in. And I hope everybody stays safe.
Perfect. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
See ya.